Hi guys, today I want to recommend to you some easy classics for beginners. I have already filmed a first part to this video, so if you'd like some more recommendations then you can go and watch that. But today I have 7 more books to share with you that I think are ideal if you're not familiar with reading classics or don't really know where to begin. When people talk to me about reading classics and give reasons for not reading them, some of the reasons include classics being too long, being too complicated, being written in old language or old English, often people say. They say that they don't have time to read them or that they are put off reading them because they do think that they'll be too confusing to read. So the books I've gathered to recommend to you are books that I think will combat them. And I would say to those people that there isn't a single classic. There are lots of classics in lots of different genres, written over lots of different time periods with different themes and ideas included in them. So there will be a classic for everyone, and I hope that some of these will offer some suggestions to you today. So I think one of the perfect books you could start with is A Study in Scarlet by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, which is the first Sherlock Holmes book. I loved this book so much, and I loved being introduced to Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. You'll probably be familiar with the story or know lots about Sherlock Holmes, so it's a good place to start because you won't have as much to think about. You'll know the general idea of the story and you'll know the format. So the first part of the book is dedicated to Sherlock Holmes figuring out the crime, and the second part is the backstory, how the crime happened, which means as a reader you are figuring out the crime as Sherlock Holmes figures out the crime. And I also found it great to figure out the dynamic between Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, and the crime in this one centres around a body found in a house in London where the body is unscathed but there's writing on the wall. Whereas A Study in Scarlet was published at the end of the 1880s, the next book I want to recommend to you is written a little bit later in the 1900s. And this book is A Room with a View by E.M. Forster, which is the perfect summer read, but I think that you can read it at any time of the year. It follows Lucy Honeychurch, who is on holiday in Italy. She's staying at the Pension Bertolini and visits lots of Italian landmarks, but when Lucy returns to her English home, she finds it difficult to conform to the Edwardian standard because she's been living a much freer lifestyle in Italy. The book deals with the changing standards between the 19th and 20th century and being caught up in a world that is changing around you but not being quite ready yet to change with it. E.M. Forster has a wonderful fluid writing style that will keep you on the edge of your seat and will have you wanting to read more and more, and I love his writing. And if you enjoyed this one, I would highly recommend Howard's End too, which is one of my favourite books of all time. At just over 200 pages too, I do think it's possible to read this one in a relatively short period of time, so those of you who are afraid of spending ages and ages on reading classics might find this one a good place to start. A recent favourite book of mine is Miss Pettigrew Lives for a Day by Winifred Watson, which was published in the 1930s. This is a Cinderella story about Miss Pettigrew who turns up for the wrong job interview and meets the elegant Miss LaFosse, who is a nightclub singer, and Miss LaFosse transforms Miss Pettigrew's life and teaches her about the world outside that she's never seen before. The book is told over the course of one day and is structured into the different times. I did read this in one afternoon because I was totally enraptured by the gorgeous writing and the wonderful illustrations, which really tell you a lot about the 1930s culture and outfits and style. The friendship that forms between Miss LaFosse and Miss Pettigrew is so heartwarming, and it was the kind of book that restores your faith in humanity and shows you a different side to pre-Second World War England. This is published by Persephone Books, who aim to publish books by women who have been forgotten, and it's also been made into a film. So it's one that you can read and then watch the film, and if you're a person who finds classics intimidating because you're unsure of the language and find it difficult to understand, then this might be a good place to start because it has a very accessible writing style. I love with all my heart Daphne du Maurier's books. I find them incredibly gripping, and once you start one you will not be able to put it down, and I would like to recommend to you My Cousin Rachel, which is about a boy called Philip who has been raised by his cousin Ambrose. And then as Philip grows older, his cousin Ambrose leaves to go to Italy and he marries a woman called Rachel. And then one day Philip receives a letter from Ambrose telling him to come to Italy quick because he fears that he is being poisoned. And then once Philip reaches Italy, he finds out that Ambrose has died, but he's sure there's more to the story than meets the eye. And the book is really about the interesting dynamic between Philip and his cousin Rachel. And as the book goes on, it gets darker and darker and is similar to gothic stories that you may know and love. I want everybody to read this book because I need to discuss the ending, which is honestly one of the best endings I have read ever. I still don't know what I think about it. I have so many conflicting thoughts on this book, but ultimately I thought it was a well-crafted, very tight book. There's no unnecessary detail. It is very fast-paced. It's very well imagined. You can see all of the events unfolding. You kind of know what's going to happen, but there's a lot of twists and turns too. So if you have the belief that classics are boring, I direct you to My Cousin Rachel, which is far from it. People can often tell me as well that they find classics humourless, that they find them quite stale and uninteresting. But one of the best classics I have read so far this year is Cold Comfort Farm by Stella Gibbons, which is a parody of lots of books that were being published around this time in the 1930s. But you don't have to have read any of the books that it is parodying to enjoy this. And this is about a young woman called Flora Post who is orphaned and goes to live with her cousins, the Starcadders. It looks at farming life through various interesting characters, such as Flora's cousin, who is a womanizer but is also obsessed with Hollywood movies, and there's also Aunt Ada Doom, who has never been outside in 20 years and speaks nonsense most of the time. One of the reasons that I love this book so much is for a very specific reason, in that the main character Flora is an orphan, and when you read a lot of classics or read a lot of fiction, characters are orphaned, and that just seems to be a huge part of who they are. But Stella Gibbons acknowledges in the book that she made Flora an orphan for a very specific reason, because it contributed to the plot. And so everything in this book contributes to the plot and is there for a very specific reason. And so you can see Stella Gibbons' influences and what she's trying to comment on, which I think makes this book genius. Another author I really love is Elizabeth Gaskell, and my favourite of her books is North and South. This might seem like an intimidating book if you've never read a classic before, because it is quite a lengthy Victorian classic, but I love it so much, and I did read this one really quickly. It has such a wonderful story with a protagonist you can't help but fall in love with, and one of my favourite romances of all time. This is about Margaret Hale, who moves from the south of England in a home she loves to an industrial town in the north of England. And if you love Pride and Prejudice, I think that you will love this just as much, because Margaret and her love interest, Mr. Thornton, had the same dynamic as Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy, and that both of them are very prejudiced, particularly Margaret, against the north, and in Mr. Thornton's case, against the south, and they have this love-hate relationship going on throughout the book, which ultimately ends in just the best scenes I have perhaps ever read. One of the reasons I recommend this as well is that there is an amazing adaptation, a BBC miniseries, which is one of my favourite BBC miniseries ever. And those last scenes, I just want to ingrain them in my brain permanently because they are so perfect. So if you've read this, then you might like to watch the adaptation, which is currently on Netflix and is one that I rewatch and rewatch a lot, just because I love it. I also think that if you are a bit nervous to read this, then it's perfectly acceptable to watch the adaptation first, or read part of the book and then watch the adaptation and then read the rest and then watch the next part of the adaptation, which might be a good way to break down the book and make sure that you understand all of it. When it comes to understanding Victorian fiction and the importance of industrialisation, this really is a key book. And then the final book I'd like to recommend to you is another Jane Austen book. This is Persuasion, and I think that this book is perhaps better than Pride and Prejudice in many ways. I think it's slightly more underrated. Pride and Prejudice is the book that everybody gravitates towards. It's the most widely known. But I think there is something very special about Persuasion. Persuasion tells the story of Anne Elliot, who 8 years before the events of the novel was engaged to be married to Captain Wentworth, but turns him down because she doesn't think that it's the right thing, and she doesn't think it's the right thing for her family and her life. So then, as the novel begins, Captain Wentworth re-enters her life but doesn't seem as interested in Anne. So it's this back and forth romance of, are they going to get together? Are they not going to get together? I think this is another book that could be considered a Cinderella type story and is very comforting in its familiarity. So as you are reading it, there are going to be elements of the story that you can anticipate and understand because they are so recognisable to modern stories and to all kinds of stories in TV and film and in novels too. Also, I love a searing, passionate letter in a good classic, and this has the best. If you've read and loved Pride and Prejudice, then please read Persuasion because I think it's just as good, if not better. So those are the classics that I would recommend if you are new to reading classics. If you are a complete beginner, then I think that these would be a great place to start. Or if you've read some other classics but aren't sure where to go next, then these books really are the best of the best. So I hope you enjoyed watching this video and found some recommendations of new books to read. I post regularly on my channel about classics, so if you'd like to find out more about classics and my reading of them, then you can watch some of my other videos. I have dedicated playlists and I'll leave some links in the description too. So thank you so much for watching this video and I will see you guys soon. Happy reading!